Let's see. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who comes from the other Queen's University, the one in Belfast. Professor Simon Davies was formerly Professor of Enlightenment Studies and Director of the Centre for 18th Century Studies at Queen's University, Belfast. He is an Honorary Research Fellow at the Voltaire Foundation, the University of Oxford, a member of the editorial committee of the complete works of Voltaire, to which he has contributed over 100 editions. He is also on the editorial committees of the correspondence and complete works of Bernardin de Saint-Pierre. Professor. His talk is Voltaire and Leadership, 1760 to 1778. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First thing I should say, Voltaire never used a microphone. So you heard that here first. He didn't use a smartphone either. In 1760, a senior citizen who called himself Voltaire took up residence at Ferney on the Swiss border. Childhood apart, this was to prove his most settled place of abode during the whole of his life. His financial circumstances enabled him to live the life of the local lord, the seigneur, who took care of his lands and the local inhabitants. In a sense, he was enacting the role of his most famous character, Candide. One recalls that the eponymous Candide, at the end of the tale published in 1759, only a year before Voltaire finally settled at Ferney, following a series of formative adventures, ends up as the leader of a band of characters who fulfilled useful functions, with the exception of the philosopher Pangloss, who does nothing but cling unbendingly to his discredited theory of the best of all possible worlds. Pangloss, who reminds me of many academics I've met in the course of my career. By the way, there's one thing a lot of people don't notice at the end of Candide. Most of the people have useful functions. Pangloss, I've just said, does nothing, but letting him do nothing is a sign of Candide's tolerance. And I think that's an important point at the end. He doesn't throw him out, he keeps him there. If the depiction of the conduct of Candide in this community near Constantinople bears a certain resemblance to that of Voltaire at Ferney, there is one outstanding difference. Candide has retired from the trials and tribulations of the world. Voltaire had certainly not. During the period under discussion, Voltaire published many new works: poems, plays, satires, pamphlets, tales, philosophical texts, texts dealing with theology, texts dealing with economics, etc., etc. I've counted more than 500. 500 in his last 18 years of life. He composed 500 new works. And this in addition, obviously, to reprints of former works, some reprints with variant editions. In this paper, I shall sketch two areas of his activity which could be subsumed under the heading of leadership. The first will be his general fight on behalf of the philosophic cause in France. The second, his engagement in the international arena. I shall focus on short texts of a polemical nature. The 1760s was a decade associated with Voltaire's fight against l'infâme. However, I'm not going to revisit his campaign for the rehabilitation of Calas, his defense of the brutally executed Chevalier de la Barre, which I think the 250th anniversary of that brutal execution is actually this year, but rather his attacks, or sometimes, more accurately, his counterattacks against those he deemed not just his personal enemies, but those of the philosophic cause. I used to wonder why Voltaire expended so much energy combating individuals who may seem generally insignificant to us in the 20th and 21st centuries. However, having spent so much time editing some of these texts, I can now understand his rationale, the motivations for his actions and reactions. In focusing on Voltaire's battles in France, I shall concentrate on three targets, three men who provoked his overwhelming wrath, namely the brothers Lefranc de Pompignan and the Abbé Nonotte. This trio had all dared to enter the public sphere to criticize Voltaire in print, and thus potentially to influence public opinion. Voltaire had come across Jean-Jacques Lefranc de Pompignan at the time of drafting his Tragédie Alzire in the 1730s. At the time, he thought that this man, he could, as it were, encourage this man to take up the philosophic cause. But such hopes did not last very long. And Jean-Jacques, obviously, this is Jean-Jacques Lefranc, not Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who obviously Voltaire also attacked greatly at this time. Jean-Jacques Lefranc de Pompignan was elected to the Académie Française and launched a savage attack on the philosophe in his Discours de Réception in March 1760. An academician himself, Voltaire could not let such a scathing discourse in a prestigious setting go unchallenged. He thus treated Jean-Jacques to appearances in a series of interlinking texts, and interlinking texts are important for Voltaire, often repeating snippets of biographical information and often stressing his adversary's vanity. Indeed, it has been suggested that the article Orgueil in the Dictionnaire philosophique, of which we'll hear more this afternoon, was aimed to some extent at him. In the third paragraph of this article, Voltaire writes, dans le fond de nos provinces, un demi-barbare, un homme qui aurait acheté une petite charge et fait imprimer des vers médiocres s'avise d'être orgueilleux. Il y a là de quoi faire rire. Jean-Jacques was from Montauban, and Voltaire was keen to present him as some provincial upstart. The opening line of the work of 1760, La Vanité, with its use of tutoiement, is devastating. Qu'as-tu, petit bourgeois d'une petite ville? Jean-Jacques was further vilified in the series of monosyllabic Les noms, les oui, les que, as well as in the chanson en l'honneur de Maître Lefranc de Pompignan. In 1763, Voltaire remained on the attack against the Montalbanais. For in 1760, a dentist named L'Écluse had come to Ferney to treat Madame Denis, his niece's teeth. However, L'Écluse had also been the stage performer and entertained Voltaire with his singing and comic antics. Later that year, Marmontel recounts how Voltaire had been so captivated by L'Écluse's talents that he imitated him by singing, I quote, avec ses bras nus et sa voix sépulcrale. The singing dentist would be surprised to discover in 1763 that he had become the author of the Lettre de Monsieur de l'Écluse, chirurgien dentiste, seigneur de Tilloy, Prémontargie, à Monsieur son curé. The supposed letter begins politely enough with the address, Monsieur mon curé. Continue, vous savez que je récrépis à mes dépenses l'église du Tilloy. Et j'ai raccommodé les 2/3 de la tribune qui était pourrie. À peine m'en avez-vous remercié. Je ne suis pas seulement remercié moi-même. Cela n'a fait aucun bruit. Tandis que Monsieur Lefranc de Pompignan de Montauban jouit d'une gloire immortelle. One notes the oral quality of this text, and so many of his texts of this time, which are not necessarily evident in his tales, in his contes, or indeed in his theatre. Voltaire stresses Jean-Jacques' self-promotion in contrast to the dentist's humility. Jean-Jacques had organized a sermon in his own praise at a church service. C'est ainsi qu'on a usé à Pompignan. On adressa la parole à M. de Pompignan, immédiatement avant d'implorer les lumières du Saint-Esprit et de la Vierge Marie. The sermon had then been published along with an account of the whole ceremony. L'Écluse note, the supposed author, notes that Monsieur le Marquis eut ce jour-là une table de 26 couverts. Je vois que la renommée est aussi injuste que la fortune. Nous étions 32 le jour de la dédicace de votre église. Et cela n'a pas seulement été remarqué dans Montargis. Moreover, in le front de Pignon's work, Jean-Jacques work, il est parlé de Madame la marquise de Montpignon. Et on n'a pas dit un mot de Madame de l'Écluse. The letter ends plaintively. Enfin, Monsieur de Pompignan jouit de tous les honneurs possibles depuis son beau discours à l'Académie française. La France ne parle que de lui. Je suis oublié. Je demande à Monsieur de l'Académie si cela est juste. If Jean-Jacques received some notoriety, it was not from his speech at the Académie Française, although he had claimed to have royal admirers, a possibility that genuinely alarmed Voltaire, but rather for the wrong reasons, as the victim of the barbed portrayals of Voltaire and indeed of others like l'Abbé Morlaix. Although not attributed directly to l'Écluse, the effectiveness of song was also employed to torment Jean-Jacques. As Robert Darnton has shown, song could prove quite a useful medium in the satirical world of the 18th century. Jean-Jacques was to get the treatment in the hymne chanté au village de Pompignan, accompagné des bourdons de Monsieur de Pompignan. This was to be sung to the air de Béchamel, the man who gave his name to the sauce. This is the second verse. Be assured, relax, I'm not going to try and sing. Though I understand on very good authority, the year this text edition came out in the complete works of Voltaire at the Voltaire Foundation, this was actually sung at their Christmas party with great gusto and repeated in the street. Il a recrépit sa chapelle et tous ses vers, il poursuit avec un saint zèle. Les gens pervers, tout son clergé s'en va chantant. Et vive le roi et Simon le Front, son favori, son favori. Voltaire was delighted to recount collective renditions of this mocking verse with its refrain, vive le roi, etc. One remarks again the reference to Jean-Jacques' refurbishment of his church. Voltaire sent the song and music to d'Alembert in February 1763. J'envoie à mon digne et parfait philosophe ces coïneries qui me sont venues de Montauban. Nous avons chanté l'hymne avec l'accompagnement. Je joins ici l'air noté. Les philosophes devraient le chanter en goguette, car il faut que les philosophes se réjouissent. Other habitual correspondence of Voltaire was sent the song. Everybody is apparently singing it. Indeed, in May 1763, he informs d'Alembert that Jean-Jacques is an object of derision. À Montauban et à Paris, on y chante sa chanson. It is essential to note that this song would be printed with a pompignade, the word used to these works attacking Pompignan. Like the lettre de Michel Lecuse, which I've just been citing, we find also in the Relation du voyage de Monsieur le Marquis de Pompignan jusqu'à Fontainebleau, adressé au procureur fiscal du village de Pompignan, if there was such a person. In this last work, Jean-Jacques is again humility. He supposedly tells his addressee that he witnessed his own gloire. Again, le repas de 26 couverts. Jean-Jacques has apparently slipped away from this acclamation de la province. And as he was speaking for himself, je pris la poste pour la cour. Ma réputation me précédait partout. On his journey, he arrived at Orléans, where he discovered la plupart des chanoines savaient déjà par cœur les endroits les plus remarquables de mon discours. Added to his collection is another very short work called the Lettre de Paris, which heaps ridicule on Jacques and repeats the refrain from the hymn. et vive le roi, etc. As I have just stated, Voltaire published some of these texts together, in one case adding an avis des éditeurs, which, as far as I'm aware, had not been published since the 18th century until I edited it for the edition. In composing this, he reutilized wounding elements from other works and added observations reinforcing the thrust of points made. And here, Voltaire is, as it were, supporting the fictional Monsieur de l'Écluse, supporting the fictional Monsieur de l'Écluse's complaint about his lack of recognition. Le curé du Tilloy a donc eu tort réellement de ne pas louer Monsieur de l'Écluse dans une circonstance tout à fait semblable à celle où Monsieur le Marquis a reçu tant d'honneur. Monsieur de l'Écluse a écrit un traité d'odontologie qui peut être utile. Pourquoi ne pas lui dire qu'il est un écrivain immortel, que ses chefs-d'œuvre sont sortis de sa plume et qu'il éclaire son siècle par ses ouvrages? So, the funny thing, L'Écluse had actually published a work on dentistry called les nouveaux éléments d'odontologie. So, Voltaire was well informed. And the abbé laments, the abbé éditeur, laments, enfin, Monsieur de l'Écluse continue à marcher comme un autre sur la surface de la terre, tandis que Monsieur le Marquis, porté au ciel par lui-même, jouit des honneurs divins. Jean-Jacques will end up being canonized as il ressemble à un saint comme deux gouttes d'eau. Let us leave Jean-Jacques on his route to sainthood and turn to his brother, Jean-Georges Le Fontaine-Pompignan. Jean-Georges was the bishop of Le Puy, who published an Instruction pastorale in 1763 attacking the so-called philosophy of modern unbelievers. Alerted to the publication by d'Alembert, who asserted that new publication was contre nous tous, a threat, an attack on all the philosophers. Voltaire soon set to work. He mirrored the title of the assailant by composing the Instruction de l'humble évêque d'Alétopolis. Alétopolis, city of truth. In the opening paragraph of the supposed pastoral, after addressing his cher frère, he states, vous savez que la vérité est au fond du puits, mais vous ne savez pas encore si Jean-Georges l'en a tiré. And here we have the play on the words, isn't it? Le Puy, the town in central France, and the well. Having taunted Jean-Georges throughout his pamphlet, he concludes, nous demeurons donc unis à Jean-Georges, et même à Jean-Jacques, quoique nous pensions différemment d'eux sur quelques articles. Ce qui nous console, remember it's supposed bishop talking here, c'est qu'on nous assure de tous côtés que l'œuvre de notre confrère Dupuis est comme l'arche du Seigneur. Elle est sainte, elle est exposée en public. Personne n'approche d'elle. Bonsoir, mes frères. Jean-Georges was not, however, to be let off with only one counterblast. Voltaire went on to demonstrate his theological and scientific knowledge in penning Les Lettres d'un Quaker à Jean-Georges. The Bishop of Le Puy is addressed in 9 sections as Ami Jean-Georges, in appropriate Quaker fashion using tutoiement. He takes Jean-Georges to task and undermines him by quoting him almost verbatim and challenging his assertions. He also ridicules the pertinence of his assertion. De quoi t'avises-tu dans une instruction dite pastorale adressée aux laboureurs, vignerons, merciers du Puy-en-Velay, de dire que le système de gravitation est menacé de décadence? Garde comment la théorie des forces s'entrépète et s'entrefuge avec la religion et les habitants du Puy-en-Velay. He ends his letter by asserting, je réfléchis avec douleur sur la superbe de certaines gens. Voilà l'origine des fausses démarches, des mauvais vers, de la prose empoulée que l'on donne hardiment au public. On veut passer pour bel esprit dans son village et à Paris. Pour y parvenir, il n'y a pas de sottises qu'on ne fasse. Quand les sottises sont faites, on veut les soutenir par des calomnies. On perd la charité comme la raison. On tombe d'abîme en abîme, ainsi que de ridicule en ridicule. On perd son âme en se faisant moquer de soi. Ah, mon frère, que ne puis-je aider à te convertir, à te rendre modéré, modeste comme tu dois l'être, à te sauver des sifflets dans ce monde et de la damnation dans l'autre. Adieu, Jean-Georges. Voltaire composed a second lettre du Quaker on similar lines and by repeating the final section, word for word. Perhaps laziness on his part, but possibly also suggesting that Jean-Georges had not learnt his lesson and that he should accept helpful advice, although the latter interpretation of his incorrigibility would doubtless have been aimed at potential readers. Leaving Le Front de Pignon brothers behind, let's pass on to my third candidate, the Abbé François Nonotte. Here Voltaire is taking particular exception to the Jesuits' Les Erreurs de Voltaire. And if you go to the exhibition in the library, you will there see an edition of Les Erreurs de Voltaire. This work, Les Erreurs de Voltaire, published the first time in 1762, purported to show the shortcomings of Voltaire. Voltaire retaliated in a number of letters. Nonotte is particularly savaged in the extensive Les Honnêtetés littéraires of 1767. But I shall deal with a short cluster of text, again interlinking text, around a production called the Lettres Anonymes, which appeared at a later date, 1769. It was only recently, only a few weeks ago, appeared in the complete works of Voltaire. These texts attack Nonotte and the Jesuits in general. Its very title evidence as the polemical tactics of its author. Its supposed anonymity prevented it from being, in fact, included in his complete works until the 19th century. Voltaire stated in the Honnêteté littéraire, c'est une grande ressource que celle des lettres anonymes. Il faut usiter chez les âmes généreuses qui disent hardiment la vérité. In January 1769, Voltaire manifests his ongoing anxiety at the Jesuits' impact. Les fanatiques lisent Nonotte et pensent qu'il a raison. So this is 1769. The first attacks were at the beginning of the 1760s. So this is a real paper war. It's a real ideological war. Voltaire was also later dismayed at the support of the Pope in a brief that the Pontiff published in French and Latin. And this is the real Pope, not an invented Pope by Voltaire. The supposed author of Lettres Anonymes points out the mistakes in his Erreurs de Voltaire, giving the impression that any educated person would not be duped by such absurd misinformation. In the Réponse to M. de Voltaire, the anonymous correspondent is praised for highlighting quelques erreurs absurdes de l'ex-jésuite Nonotte, while stressing comparable mistakes perpetrated generally by members of the Society of Jesus, remembering that the Jesuits were suppressed in France in 1764. Voltaire, inverted commas, received another fictitious letter entitled Lettre à M. de Voltaire au sujet de l'ex-jésuite Nonotte du 7 février 1769. This supposedly composed primarily by Bigex. Bigex was an actual copyist of Voltaire. He'd only gone to his employment in 1768. And he played roles in other subsequent Voltaire works. There are then additional contributions, supposedly by Voltaire's secretary, Wagner, and then supposedly by Voltaire himself, and then finally by Cramer, his printer. The letter stresses the practical activities of Voltaire in aiding mankind, in contrast to the ignorant ramblings of Nonotte. Wagner refutes claims about Voltaire, a refutation subsequently endorsed by the fictional Voltaire. Finally, Cramer, the printer, denies printing a sentence attributed to him by Nonotte in the Essai sur les mœurs. Truth must be paramount. The series ends with an observation, important, penned again by Bigex, defending Voltaire and condemning Nonotte for his distortions. What's my time? I'll skip a little. I want to talk a little bit, but I'll skip it, about what Voltaire did for the people near Ferney. I think this is important. Here in particularly case with the Jesuit Ornex, he attacked them and genuinely righted wrongs. Some impoverished people had sold or basically been ripped off, if you like, for their land. And Voltaire fought them, and this was not to his financial advantage or his greater glory, but he did settle some things in his local area in that fashion. I now go on briefly to talk about Voltaire in international affairs. It's well known that Voltaire curried favour with kings, particularly in the north of Europe, Frederick the Great, obviously, but also the kings of Denmark and Sweden. Some of these connections, by all means, may be a certain amount of vanity on his part, but basically, I think it's fair to say we should not underestimate his desire to use his influence to urge them to exercise their power in what he hoped would be enlightened activities. Here, I should like to focus on Eastern Europe, and particularly on his relationship with Catherine the Great. I mention this because I happened to be in Montreal and saw the Catherine Great exhibition 10 years ago, so it seemed very appropriate to do that. Voltaire and Catherine corresponded for about 15 years. We have still about 200 letters exchanged between them. Voltaire's relationship with Catherine is a subject of much controversy, as his attitude to her actions in Poland have been subject to stringent criticism, sometimes, I think, with the benefit of hindsight. Voltaire believed, or at least wanted to believe, that her intervention in Polish affairs was guided by the enlightened principle of religious tolerance. With the partition of Poland, he was to learn that his beliefs and hopes were on shaky ground. In relation to Catherine's other military escapade, the war with Turkey in 1768, that was a different matter. He might view this as a campaign for religious tolerance, but also very significantly as a war for what he held to be civilization. His opposition to the place and power of Turkey derived from cultural rather than specifically from political or religious values. He did not like the presence of Turks in Europe and harboured what some might term almost a sentimental championing of Greece. He felt that the European powers should be united in driving out Turkish influence. Catherine's war seemed a splendid opportunity to enact his desires. I shall confine my remarks to two short texts. The first is called Traduction du poème de Jean Blockhoff, published in 1770. In spite of his title, it's not a translation, nor is it a poem. And needless to say, it's stated author Jean Blockhoff, with his French first name and his Russian surname, is as fictitious as his supposed profession. He's supposed to be a conseiller d'Holstein. Catherine the Great received a copy and wrote back enthusiastically. La traduction du charmant petit poème de M. Blockhoff m'a fait un plaisir infini. Il est aussi rempli de feu et d'imagination que pouvait l'être l'ouvrage d'un jeune homme. Mais à la raison supérieure qui y règne, l'on voit bien qu'il y a déjà quelque temps que M. Blockhoff a quitté les universités. Comme cet homme-là est allemand, il y a apparence qu'il fera gagner plus d'un procès à la Chambre impériale de Wetzlar, lorsqu'il se donnera la peine de plaider les juges, se rangeant aisément de son côté. Je reconnais partout votre amitié pour moi. L'envoi du poème de M. Blockhoff en est une nouvelle preuve à laquelle je suis sensible. And here, I'll just give you a couple of quotes from this, but anti-Turkish. Aux armes, princes et républiques, chrétiens, et si longtemps acharnés les uns contre les autres, pour des intérêts aussi faibles que malentendus. Aux armes contre les ennemis de l'Europe. And it's interesting, de l'Europe. De l'Europe. Russia is praised for initiative. Le génie de la Russie a déployé ses ailes brillantes. Voltaire finds time to censure the Church. But the essential focus remains on Turkey. Le temps de détruire les Turcs est venu. Given the emphasis on Eastern Europe, the pamphlet was translated into Greek by a librarian, Eugenius Bulgaris, who was employed at the court in St. Petersburg, and published there in 1771. It was also translated into Romanian. My second short text is entitled Le Tocsin des Rois, which came out in 1771. I chose to speak about Le Tocsin for a variety of reasons. The first of these is indeed connected with the symposium. While I was engaged in preparing the edition for the complete works of Voltaire, I received an email informing me that there was an unknown edition for sale in Paris. After the investigation, I purchased it. The email was sent to me by the late Patrick Lee, who you heard about this morning. On 20th November 1771, a Russian minister, Shwalov, wrote to Voltaire seeking his assistance. He had been commanded to do so by Catherine the Great. Catherine wanted Voltaire to produce an article on her behalf, which was to contain a list of prescribed items, 6 in all. 1. Sur l'horreur de l'attentat commis sur le roi Stanislas. There was an attempt on King Stanislaus of Poland. Put that in. Rappeler à l'empereur des Romains que les Ottomans ont mis 2 fois le siège devant Vienne. To address Joseph II of the siege of Vienna. Third, comment peut-on supporter des garnisons turques dans des villes polonaises? Fourth, sur la manière indigne et contre le droit des gens avec lesquels la porte ottomane traite les missions des puissances étrangères. Et on citait quelques exemples. So she's telling Voltaire, you know, I don't know, put some examples in. You know what to put in. 5. Jeter en avant l'étonnement qu'aurait Jean Sobieski de voir ses compatriotes alliés des Turcs, Jean Sobieski, the great Polish hero of the late 17th century. And finally, in 6 point, les folles croisades durent autrefois plus de 100 ans. Pourquoi aujourd'hui la sage union des 2 ou 3 têtes couronnées est-elle impraticable? We must act. Voltaire was told to find a young man, to pen a polemical work which did not indulge in subtle poetic arms, but rather sought to, I cite, plus frapper le vulgaire que le persuader. One recalls that Catherine had used the term jeune homme in her praise of Jean Blokhov. The work was to remain secret. Voltaire was happy to oblige as a spin doctor. He wrote approvingly of Catherine in a letter in December 1701 as l'héroïne qui venge l'Europe de l'insolence des Turcs, malgré une partie de l'Europe. He set to work with alacrity, and the text was composed before the end of the year. He himself considered several titles of the work. Appel aux nations, Avis aux nations, before choosing Tocsin des rois. Since Catherine had requested it should be an article de journal, Voltaire promised that it would appear in the press in the following January. And indeed, it duly appeared in the Mercure historique et politique in January 1772. Here it is described as une charmante pièce qui vient de nous tomber dans les mains et qui roule sur les grandes affaires du temps. The author's name does not appear at the head of the text. However, if Catherine really wanted her propagandist name to remain unknown, she would have been disappointed. One rather doubts that that was really what she wanted. In the table de matière, we find Tocsin des rois, pièce attribuée à Voltaire. Furthermore, at the end of the text, the reader is advised, il n'est pas nécessaire d'avertir que cette pièce anonyme, intitulée Le Tocsin des rois, est attribuée en France au célèbre Monsieur de Voltaire. A nouvelle à la main, circulating news sheet in early January 1772, reports the printing of the text and provides a useful summary by stating that the Seigneur de Ferney, therefore no doubt about this, vient dans cette page d'impression qu'il intitule Le Tocsin des rois de faire sentir l'horreur que tous les honnêtes gens doivent avoir du complot infâme et abominable qui a menacé les jours du roi de Pologne. Trouve moyen de célébrer l'impératrice reine de Russie et de rendre à l'empereur le juste tribut du longe que toute l'Europe ne cesse de lui donner. Il finit par invoquer toutes les puissances de l'Europe pour se réunir à la tsarine afin d'exterminer la nation turque qui le regarde comme un fléau qu'on ne peut éloigner de notre climat. Therefore, no doubt about this, everybody knew this was by Voltaire. The Opposition Nouvel Allemand refers to a 7-page printing. There is indeed a 7-page edition, published without author, date, or place of publication. There are others which may well have been published in 1772, one of 16 pages without printed numbering, but with Voltaire named. Another with pages numbered 3 to 14 and printed in italics, but with Voltaire name. Yet another in 14 pages without Voltaire being named. This is one that I purchased myself. And I well imagine other printings of the slim pamphlet may be lurking in archives or simply lost to posterity. It did subsequently appear in major editions of Voltaire's works. Given again its Eastern European dimensions, it was translated into Greek, Russian, and in manuscript into Romanian. It has been suggested by a Romanian scholar that the Romanian version was probably instigated by Catherine herself. There's apparently a portrait of the Empress attached to it. Another Romanian scholar has told me that Le Tocsin, as well as the Traduction du poème de Jean Blokhov, were the first texts translated into Romanian directly from French without passing through Greek. I can't give that no knowledge. I won't bore you with going through what Voltaire did. He did mention all these 6 points, but rather than referring to the attack on King Stanislav as an attentat, he called it an assassinat. He made it stronger, but the people who followed the political scene knew perfectly well that the King of Poland had not been assassinated. What also I think is important here, in his lesson, he says to the king, since it is a Tocsin, he's addressing it to kings, if you want to go to posterity, you must do something. You know, this is Voltaire, the historian, writing. I mentioned that Catherine said to him, you give details of how Western European diplomats treated in Constantinople. And he does supply details. He goes to the work by James Porter, who had been British ambassador at Constantinople, who published a work in 1768, which was then translated into French, and Voltaire had 1769 and 1770 editions, which he used. And so he put the material in. So, in sum about that, we can say here is Voltaire involving himself overtly in current European conflict. Catherine clearly regarded him as a potent public relations agent who could win support for a cause in French-speaking Europe. By way of conclusion, one could suggest that if Voltaire can be envisaged as an old sage during his last years, he is not one who has retired from the world. From the periphery of Ferney, he put himself at the center of current affairs in Europe. It's impossible to calculate accurately how many of his short works were copied, circulated, reviewed, possibly with extracts in periodicals. They could clearly have been read out loud or even sung in company, fostering collective, convivial pleasure. Voltaire enjoyed composing these texts. He had a sense of fun, imagined his readers enjoying them while simultaneously undermining his enemies, their opinions and doctrines. He enlisted a multinational troupe of invented writers, sometimes real people, alive or dead, totally fictitious authors, anonymous correspondents, all conscripts in his philosophical campaigns. Catherine the Great's soldiers had guns, artillery, and sabres, whereas Voltaire had words which were sent on maneuvers through the power of the printing presses, or simply through letters or copied manuscripts. Voltaire became a brand, a dangerous brand for his detractors. Attacking Voltaire showed the dangers of his influence, hence the banning of his books and their inclusion in Rome on the Catholic Index. People looked to him for leadership. In the midst of hostilities from anti-philosophe quarters, d'Alembert wrote to him, "C'est très bien au chef de recommander l'union frère," and here he is quoting a letter by Voltaire, "mais il faut que le chef, i.e. Voltaire, reste à leur tête." To finish, I shall quote a modified line from work published in 1769. Si Voltaire n'existait pas, il faudrait l'inventer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's 12:30 right now, time for lunch. If someone has one very quick question, we could address it. Yes, the one very quick question.
Merci beaucoup pour vos discours très intéressants. J'aimerais savoir, je suis étudiant de littérature espagnole, mais je ne connais pas les œuvres de Voltaire. Quelle œuvre est-ce que vous me recommanderiez lire en premier?
Candide. All right. Can we take a show of hands? Candide, it's the first book you should read if you're going to read any one book by Voltaire. All right. That sounds like an excellent opportunity to discuss over for lunch. We'll